We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Coming up this week,
oil might be about to fall out of bed. An almighty concatenation of the US elections, the Houthis in the Red Sea, the Israelis striking Iran, and the Iranians striking the Strait of Hormuz. If it pushes toward $300 a barrel, they'll be laying it down like Chateau Lafite.
Meanwhile, Serbia says it might be joining the BRICS rather than entering the EU. Is it really that important to get away from the Croatians? Or is it more to do with the increasingly centripetal force of its Russia relationship? Luckily, great power competition in the Balkans has very few bad historical connotations.
Finally, 153 Chinese military aircraft plus drones and warships encircled Taiwan on Monday as the Chinese Python gave its rebel alliance a friendly squeeze. But this is more than just another shot across the bows. It's a clue that far from the Private Ryan D-Day fantasy, the Chinese might choose to take the island by siege.
But first,
pouring oil on troubled waters.
Well, there's a lot happening in the oil market. I suppose we can work from the most recent event backwards in a sense, because the most recent event shows that the markets are deep in cope mode. The Washington Post published a story at the start of the week that said that Netanyahu was not going to strike nuclear and energy facilities in Iran, but rather was going to strike military targets, and the price of WTI crude oil futures fell by $3 from $74 to $71. That's a big fall in 2 trading days. It's also a very big fall in response to one story in the newspaper, but especially it's a very big fall relative to one story in the newspaper that was completely unsourced, as far as I could tell. The Washington Post cited 2 officials familiar with the matter. So this was not an official Israeli government statement. Bibi Netanyahu did not come out and say it on television. His Minister of Defense didn't say it. No official said it. Somebody whispered it to the Washington Post. It could have been one Washington Post journalist whispering it to another in the newsroom. We don't know. That is not a story, that is gossip. And people in the oil market should actually be more than familiar with such gossip if they're covering the oil market, because such gossip always comes out around OPEC meetings and so on. And you shouldn't be trading such gossip in general, but you should definitely not be trading $3 a barrel worth of gossip. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the oil market is quite frightened right now. Oil has been bearish for a very long time. We've covered it on the show before. I've criticized the oil market. I've said that it's not being realistic, that I think that the market is broken, being subject to short selling, probably by hedge funds, and that trading algorithms are probably driving part of that decline, with the hedge funds triggering the trading algorithms. Well, the market's been in a bear market for a long time, despite all the global turmoil. Despite the turmoil in the Middle East for the past year, it's been in a bear market. Oil just keeps going lower and lower. Chinese economy speeds up, hits its growth targets. Europe doesn't go into recession. Oil keeps falling. Then the Middle East crisis comes along, and it becomes pretty hard to ignore that a crisis in the Middle East could prove absolutely catastrophic for oil supplies. I'll go into that in a moment. And so the market rallies for a while, for a few days. Rallies quite hard, where you're getting 3% increases in the price of barrel of oil day after day. Those are significant market trading increases. And then the bears look for their story, and they find it. So paint a picture of here is a highly volatile market that has 2 forces driving in opposite directions. So let's just quickly say something about the actual objective facts here. The Middle East is on the brink of war. It may happen, it may not, but there's a decent probability that a war will break out in the Middle East. And I don't think anyone would tell you otherwise. If war breaks out into the Middle East, it will disrupt the supply of oil. The only question is to what extent. On the lighter side of oil disruptions in the Middle East in event of war, we're probably talking about military attacks on Iranian oil infrastructure. Iran is a significant oil producer in itself, and Iranian responses attacking other oil infrastructure in the region. Probably at this stage, American adjacent oil supplies in Iraq and Syria. But you never know how far it could go. The Iranians before have attacked Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia, but this was a few years ago before they became friends again. The Iranians have the capability to strike these things with drones and so on. That's on the lighter side of a disruption. The heavy side of a disruption is a regional war results in Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz carries between 20 and 30% of global oil supplies. So 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 barrels of oil come through the Strait of Hormuz. If the Strait of Hormuz is blockaded, and the Iranians are perfectly capable of doing it, the Houthis have blockaded the Red Sea, the Iranians have multiple times the capacities to do so. If they blockaded the Strait of Hormuz, the impact on the oil market will be absolutely catastrophic. I did some numbers on it this week, and I came to the conclusion that you'd be talking about at least $200, $210 a barrel oil, and that will probably lead to about 18% inflation in the UK and the US. This would make the previous increase in the price of oil in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine look like child's play, and it would make the previous round of inflation looks like child's play. So that's where we stand at the moment. The market, completely bizarre, never seen anything like it in my life, but that's where the market is. We'll have to see, will the bulls overcome the bears? But the moment actual oil production starts going down, if that indeed happens, we're going to see extreme events in global energy markets.
I think it's definitely important to treat the Washington Post article with a pinch of salt. The US and the US media has a history of this. There's been a constant, maybe constant is too strong a word, but a regular stream of hugely optimistic statements, both from official sources through press conferences, through the US State Department and the White House itself, and unnamed sources quoted in articles about this current conflict in the Middle East, whether it be help from the Egyptians negotiating, or the release of hostages, or a deal that Netanyahu has supposedly accepted, but then turns out that he hasn't at all. There has been a regularly over-optimistic, over-bullish outlook emanating from official US sources or unnamed sources reported by the press on this conflict. So when we read in the Washington Post that the Israelis have promised not to attack Iranian oil facilities, I do think that we should treat that with a grain of salt. The other thing that I don't think I've seen mentioned anywhere is that it's extremely important to differentiate between Iran's oil facilities. Of course, what comes to mind when people think about that are their crude oil extraction facilities. But it might be equally damaging to the Iranian economy if Israel clobbered Iran's refineries, where they take the crude oil and turn it into kerosene and gasoline and all of the other oil cracks that are crucial for the running of any modern economy. My impression at the moment is people in Washington and in the rest of the Middle East are really stressed out about Israel potentially attacking these oil facilities. We saw the Saudis cleaving very closely to the Iranians recently. That may be in general because they're moving close to the Iranians. We've reported that on Multipolarity. But my impression was that the sudden statement was a case of saying, look, guys, if Israel clobbers your oil facilities, it's got nothing to do with us. We're on your side. Because the Iranians have in the past and quite recently threatened to respond to any attack on its oil facilities, which would deal a really hefty blow to the Iranian economy, which isn't in the best of shape anyway, because of the decades of sanctions. They've threatened to respond to any attack with an attack on other Gulf oil facilities. You know, the Ghawar field, this giant Saudi field that's responsible for a huge amount of Saudi Arabia's production. It's just a few miles across the Persian Gulf from Iran. The Saudis have already proven that they cannot defend their oil fields when drones from the Houthis got through onto Saudi fields. There's no chance against a full-on Iranian missile attack. So I think the Saudis are super stressed about this prospect. You can be damn sure the White House are. They do not want, under any circumstances, the oil price to go completely lollapalooza right before an election. It would just spell catastrophe. I think it's still going to be a close election. You can forget about it if the price of crude oil increases by 40 or 50% overnight and stays there. That's just the end of it. Donald Trump is walking into the White House under those circumstances. So I think that if the Israelis went ahead anyway and tried and succeeded in clobbering Iranian oil facilities, it would be so diplomatically isolated for doing that. The White House would be beyond livid. The Saudis would be furious. The Emiratis would be angry with them. All of their kind of half and half allies or not sworn enemies in the Middle East, the White House itself, which is their major donor, they would all be so furious about it. And I suspect that oil traders are seeing the same signs and they're starting to calm down a little bit. However, just because the Israelis don't attack Iran's oil facilities does not mean that they're not going to hit Iran in a way where the Iranians strike back and we're well into the escalation ladder toward a full-blown Middle Eastern war. The escalation ladder in the Middle East is extremely clear, and it's still at play. Nobody has climbed off since the Iranian attack on Israel, and it's still there. And you're quite right in saying that a regional war is possible, and it would be very difficult to imagine a regional war in the Middle East not fairly seriously damaging oil supply from the Middle East. It's difficult to understand how that would kind of work out at all. It would seem to me, anybody who suggests such, we need to ask some very serious questions about the mechanics of how that would work. So while I think that it's fair to imagine that Israel will not strike at certainly crude oil production facilities, and probably not the refining as well, because of the reasons I outlined, because of just how diplomatically isolated they would be, how furious it would make their main ally, their most important ally by a long way, and those remaining countries in the Middle East who, aren't in a state of, frenzied enmity towards the Jewish state. It would leave them apoplectic as well. So for that reason, I don't think Israel's going to attack. But does that matter? We're still on this escalation ladder, and regional war is still possible. And in that sort of scenario, we can expect disruption of the oil market.
I think the Israelis are perfectly willing to strike oil facilities because I don't think they see themselves as having a choice. They see this conflict as existential. Whether it is or not is a different story, but that's how they see it. And there's limited targets that they can actually strike in Iran. They talk a lot about the nuclear stuff and all that, but I think this stuff's probably buried underground. People say, oh, well, they got Nasrallah with their 1 million bombs. You can't carry that amount of munitions into Iran. I think any airstrike in Iran's going to be enormously difficult anyway. That's a whole different story. Maybe we'll cover it in another show. But I think they could totally do it because it's a way for them to knock out the economic capacity of Iran. And to my mind, I'm not saying this is a realistic plan, but I'm saying it is a plan, and it is one of the only plans that I can see. Knock out the oil supplies, wreck the Iranian economy, and hope for regime change. I think that's pretty much what the strategy will be. I think that's what they're probably thinking. So I would not discount that. But it brings in another factor, which you just mentioned, which is the election. This, I think, is very important because there is a little bit of an incentive structure here that has not been widely discussed. You're absolutely correct. Joe Biden does not want to see the price of oil rise before an election. We're only a couple of weeks out from an election. My feeling is they can absolutely restrain Israel for those couple of weeks because they're busy anyway in Lebanon, and they'd probably need time to put together a strike package and a plan and so on. Whether it works or not, we'll see. I'm very skeptical. But even if it doesn't, they need time to put together the best plan and the best strike package that they can do. And when I, by the way, said I thought Iran would do it, people said, oh, you're pro-Iranian or whatever. Okay, here, dispel the myth. I think Israel will strike Iran. It's nothing to do with partisanship. It's just how you read these situations. So basically, I think they will stop until the election. And then there's a choice facing the Biden administration. I firmly think Donald Trump is going to win the election, but we'll see. In the case that Donald Trump does win, there is actually an incentive for the Biden administration to allow the Israelis to then do what they want to do. Because at that point, why do the Democrats care? One of the things that Donald Trump has basically run on is that under me, Trump, the economy was much better than under him, Biden, which is 100% true. And the average American knows it because they've experienced a nasty cost of living crisis due to the inflation there. Well, the Biden administration would be like, okay, well, if inflation comes in, it'll destroy the Trump administration. Because he's promising, the biggest promise actually he's making, apart from maybe immigration, but actually I think even bigger than that, is I'm going to sort out the economy and you're not going to feel poorer than you did 5 years ago anymore. And Biden allowing the Israelis to do what they want to do would destroy the Trump administration and any hope they'd have of having a successful presidency. I really do believe that. And I'd imagine that is widely understood in DC. The question then is how cynical Democrat politicians are. I think in this day and age, they're very cynical. I think they are willing to put party above country. They recently had an event saying country above party with Kamala Harris. But I think that's kind of Freudian projection, or Freudian denial or whatever you want to call it. I think that's the state of American politics. It's very sad. Which brings me to my final point. American energy independence, this much vaunted myth of American energy independence. So the first thing to say is independence or non-independence doesn't actually matter. The global market for oil is global. And the global price is global. Okay, Brent oil and WTI oil have slightly different pricing structures. And Russian Urals oil, has a slightly different pricing structure too. But the correlation is probably like 0.95 for anyone who does such things. 95%. They move together, yeah? Probably about that. And so if the price of oil goes up, it will go up everywhere. The only alternative to that is for America to enact some sort of a World War II style economy where they don't trade any oil and then they subsidize prices domestically. Price controls, full on oil price controls. Okay, possible, but don't think it'll actually bring down the price, to be honest. It might bring it down a little bit, but it'll interfere a lot. It will be awful. It'll be completely opposed by the oil lobbies. It just doesn't feel like a crisis in the Middle East is big enough to justify World War II style or World War I style total war price controls. So that's the first point. The second point is, I'm not actually sure if America is energy independent. I've been looking into this for the past couple of days, and I've been tweeting about it a little bit. And what I've noticed is that the EIA, that's the Energy Information Agency, it's an official agency in DC, has very strange reporting standards. You can't get a clear answer out of them. If you go to most countries, you can find out two key variables, very simple variables: amount of oil produced and amount of oil consumed. They're very simple variables. They're a lot easier to track than GDP, right? So even poor countries can produce these numbers because they just count the amount of oil barrels that are sold and consumed, and they count the amount of oil barrels that are produced. The EIA is extremely coy about this. And I can't actually tell if America is energy independent or not for crude oil. What they do is they lump all these energy sources together into something called terawatt hours, which is a completely theoretical metric, whereas a barrel of oil is not a theoretical metric. And then they say America, on balance, is energy independent. This is where you hear this meme. That does not mean that America produces enough crude oil to meet their consumption needs. If it's that hard to tell if America produces enough crude oil domestically for the consumption needs, then somebody's probably trying to hide it. Somebody probably does not want you to know that. I don't know who it is. Maybe it's the Biden administration don't want people knowing that because they don't want to turn on the fracking wells. I don't know what the motivation is. Maybe it's America trying to project power abroad, in which case, very bad idea because you're just baking in bad decision making into your process. But all I can say is, from looking at it for a couple of hours and doing a fairly deep dive, I cannot tell if America produce enough barrels of crude oil for their consumption needs. And that's very, very strange. So my underlying assumption is they do not. And that means if a serious crisis occurs the price will impact them. There's no way around that, or there's almost no way. There's only an extreme solution to that they probably wouldn't undertake and that might not even work. But beyond that, if they don't have the domestic production capacity, just like Europe don't, you could actually be facing oil shortages at that stage. And we've seen that movie before. It was the 1973 oil embargo. We've seen what that looks like. Cars queuing up at gas stations, as they called them there. I mean, my father remembers queuing up for petrol in Ireland in the 1970s. That's a very real thing. And the disruption to the economy is absolutely huge. So all that's worth thinking about. We could be seeing shortages in such an event. But on top of that, I'd encourage American listeners, don't believe everything you hear about so-called energy independence. It looks like a bit of a myth to me, and the data is very shaky. And the last thing is, watch the election. If Trump gets voted in, the incentives suggest that there is far more likelihood of a regional war in the Middle East. I'm only going on the incentives as the political actors involved. If I'm incorrect about their moral turpitude or whatever, and that actually the Democrats are willing to put country above party, completely discount what I'm saying. But I think they're willing to put party above country, in which case the incentive structure is such that strikes and so on will probably take place after the election.
I would just add one thing to that, which I absolutely hadn't considered at all, Philip Pilkington, this idea that if Trump wins the election, then the incentive structure changes. I would just say, though, that the election won't necessarily be over on that first Thursday in November. If it's in any way close, or there are some swing states which are in any way close and can affect the election, it's entirely possible that a period of lawfare takes place. And that could, in theory, last right up to Inauguration Day. So, in the event that that happens, that incentive structure doesn't quite swing in the same manner on election night. Now, you're fairly confident in a big Trump win, not a landslide, but a fairly convincing Trump win. But anyone who thinks it'll be anywhere close, the incentive structure might not necessarily shift as much if there is a period of lawfare. And that could happen whoever appears to have won on the night. The second point I would say about that incentive structure is you would still have some very nervy Middle Eastern countries like the Emirates, like Saudi Arabia. And also the Iranians might be concerned with the effect on China, because it would really affect China as well. It is the biggest purchaser of crude oil from the Middle East. It's not Europe anymore. It's not the US anymore. It's China. And China is Iran's biggest ally, basically. I believe I'm right in saying its most important ally, if not the most important, certainly one of the most important, along with Russia. So these are all issues that are going to be, that people have to bear in mind. But I think those are really extremely good points about the incentive structure. And I think it's really important in a situation like this where it's clearly non-linear. It's not one of these things where we can use it if-then prediction system. It's not a situation where you can see moves on a chessboard. If he moves that, they move that, they move that. This is a real non-linear system that could go in a whole variety of ways. And the process of escalation is very clear. Thinking about a worst-case scenario, even if it's not the most likely scenario, even if it's relatively unlikely, is extremely important in this, because if that oil is disrupted, it has really serious effects for the entire world.
First come, first Serb.
This week, Serbia announced that it was going to send a representative to the BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia, and it was seeking to move toward BRICS membership. President of Serbia, Alexander Vucic, said that this might be an alternative to EU membership. Now, that seems very strange to me, because although BRICS on social media and even in some quite serious media like the Financial Times or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal often gets compared or suggested as a kind of global South alternative to a whole range of Western institutions, from NATO to the European Union, I think it's fair to say that it is not an alternative to organizations like that. I said a year ago, I think, on this podcast, and I stand by it, that BRICS is actually far more closely, or can be far more closely compared to something like the G7 or the G20 It's a forum in which these countries can get together and discuss some of their issues. Now, BRICS does have a development bank now, but it hasn't been doing much. So it has ambitions in the future to build the powers and build the teeth of the development bank to grow it into something that could perhaps in future rival the World Bank and maybe even the IMF as well. It also has certain ambitions with regard to trade and payment systems. But compared to the European Union, which has its own single currency, it has its own single market, it has 100% tariff-free internal movement of goods, internal movement of people as well, internal movement of capital, most importantly. Services, in theory, it has free internal movement, but in practice, not really quite as much. It's nothing like that at all. And I don't think that when we hear people say, well, instead of joining the EU, Serbia could join the BRICS, I don't think we should take that seriously. I think we should be very clear about that. I think what Vučić is doing here is he's really offering a sop to his domestic audience. That's my suspicion. I don't know much about Serbian internal politics, but Serbia has been an EU candidate, officially an EU candidate. Obviously, they were exploring and negotiating with the EU long before that. But it first opened the accession negotiation process 10 years ago. Almost 11 years ago now. It was in January 2014. The main sticking point, I mean, you know, Serbia, of course, it's a developing economy. It's an Eastern European developing economy, and it has many of the same issues that those who understand Eastern Europe will know about. But I don't see Serbia being as significantly worse than, say, Romania or Bulgaria on such matters. The main sticking points with Serbia are its refusal to accept Kosovo as a sovereign state. As the EU puts it, normalize relations with Kosovo, which essentially means them recognizing Kosovo and moving toward recognizing Kosovo in law as an independent sovereign state. The Serbians, for obvious reasons, don't want to do that, although the West are keen to do that. Serbia still sees Kosovo as a part of its territory. It believes that territories cannot be redrawn at the barrel of a gun, which NATO did. For whatever justifications or reasons, ultimately they redrew sovereign territory against Serbia's wishes, and Serbia doesn't want to recognize that. That's the main sticking point. Although the process has been going on in a range of other areas, there's a whole range of packages and clusters that Serbia has to go through. That's the main issue. That's the main sticking point. Added to that has been Serbia's neutral stance when it comes to Russia. It hasn't joined in the same level of sanctions. It hasn't condemned Russia because Serbia historically, for historic reasons, has been a close ally of Russia. So I think that Serbia doing this, I actually think it's very sensible for Serbia to get involved with BRICS. There's fairly significant Chinese investment in Serbia. There's also a fairly decent amount of Russian investment as well. If you go to Serbia, you see the names of certain Russian oil companies, for example, providing petrol and having big offices there and having stakes in Serbian refineries, for example. So I think it makes sense for Serbia to get involved with this organization because as it grows and as perhaps they build greater institutional teeth and start being able to offer greater institutional incentives and benefits, that would be a good thing. And it would help Serbia further align with the shift toward multipolarity, which this whole show's about. But to say it's an alternative to the EU is just, it's simply not. It's certainly not at the moment, and it's not likely to be anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't read the messaging. There is definitely messaging going on here, but I wouldn't say it's directed at the Serbian domestic audience. I think it's probably actually directed at the Europeans. I think it's Serbia saying, if you guys don't pull the finger out on EU membership, we might look elsewhere. Now, is that actually a serious argument? Okay, well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The BRICS is more like the G7 than the EU. It's not a free trade bloc, etc. Trade deals will get done, investment deals will get done at BRICS. This is what this is going to look like. and it will be a huge force in shaping the 21st century. Anyone who tells you that the BRICS is meaningless doesn't know what they're talking about. But it is definitely true. It is not the EU. It's not setting up a free trade bloc. It doesn't have a commission. It doesn't have a democratic element. It doesn't have any of these things. Fine. Well, here's the thing to consider here, and I think Serbia probably have thought about this. The EU doesn't look nearly as good as it did 20 years ago, to be honest. It doesn't even look as good as it did 10 years ago, and 10 years ago it was experiencing a sovereign debt crisis. The EU right now is a basket case. We talk about it all the time on the show. It's deindustrializing. It's run by clowns. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound too partisan or whatever, but the von der Leyen mafia is the most clownish leadership class I've ever seen in my life anywhere. I mean, I don't want to say von der Leyen's controlled by a foreign power, but she might as well be. Her interests are in some weird geopolitical posturing. They're not in Europe's interests. She's not elected by anyone. It's an absurd system that's going on in Europe at the moment. It's deindustrializing, as I said. It's doing these bizarre tariff policies. If you know anything about the EU, you'll know that it's the biggest trading bloc in the world, right? So you have fairly large economies like China or the United States and the EU. And the EU trades much more imports and exports than China or the US. It's defined by its trading with the rest of the world. And it's engaged in this bizarre protectionist policy. It puts out the Draghi report. We did a show on that the other week. The Draghi report is a joke written by clowns. There's no other way to put it. It's not a serious economic report. It's Pravda. We called it economic Lysenkoism in a previous show. So what I'm getting at is the EU is in a wreck at the moment. Now, there may be salvaging the EU. I'm very skeptical of the EU. I'm very skeptical of extreme federalism in the EU. I think it's the death of the entire project. We're seeing that right now with the Ursula von der Leyen mafia. But, in theory, the EU would be a pretty good asset in a world of multipolarity because it would be a serious pole or a serious bloc. So, I wouldn't write off the EU completely. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that the EU currently is looking like Brezhnev's Russia or something like that, Brezhnev's Soviet Union. It looks like a complete basket case. So if you're the Serbians, and I think the Serbians are actually very sophisticated, and I think they're very rational, I think they probably still, on balance, think that the EU is a pretty good bet. And if they were offered tomorrow to get into the Union, I think they would. They ditch their currency. I don't think they're that naive, but they'd take the position of a Poland or a Hungary or something like that and enter the Union without compromising their currency. But I think, on the other hand, they can see which way the winds are blowing, and they say, look, if the EU isn't that interested in us, we're not as interested in you as we were 5 years ago. And I think that's what they're signaling here. And, in that regard, I think there's some truth to what they're saying. Of course, if they join the BRICS, they're not going to get the free trade zone or whatever, but they're not going to get the EV tariffs on China either. They're not going to get the crippling energy prices either, you see? So what they're kind of signaling here is we're not as interested as we were before. And I think that's a very serious signal. The politics that are going on both in Serbia and in the region are very interesting right now. They're very, very heated, and they're not really being discussed in the broader Western press. I think that they've got very, how should I put it? Well, fractious and heated, I suppose, since the Robert Fico attempted assassination. This week, the Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó went to Serbia, went to Belgrade, where he was informed that there was a plan for an assassination of Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary. I don't know if these allegations are true, but the very fact that the Serbians said this to the Hungarians means something. It means that the region is looking really unstable, and it's looking really fractious. And that again speaks to what's going on at the moment, that the EU is not the peaceful place that it once looked like. The EU used to scoff at the Balkans, at Serbia. Oh, that's a place where violence takes place. That's a place where people get assassinated and wars happen. Well, Europe looks like that nowadays. Okay, the war is on Europe's borders, but they fully backed a massive war in which hundreds of thousands of people have died, and they're not even winning it. When Serbia looks at that, it has to say, wow, you used to say that we were the Balkans, we were the unstable place, we were the place where political assassinations take place. And now we're communicating to a member of your own European Union that one of your leaders might be assassinated. And of course, there was an attempt on a European leader's life recently in Robert Fico in Slovakia. So I think Serbia really is signaling quite strongly to the EU here, you're not all you're cracked up to be anymore. A lot of the stereotypes that you applied to the Balkans regions for very long can now, a mirror can be held up from here and we can say, you look like you have more problems than we do. And we're probably still interested in joining your club in an abstract sense. But there are other things on the menu these days.
There used to be three big reasons why countries like Serbia would want to join the EU. The first was access to this huge internal market and seamless free trade. That did reduce the cost of trading massively for smaller countries like Serbia, for whom the European Union was the biggest trading partner. And what that means, first of all, is stuff costs less inside Serbia for consumers, but it also means that Serbian companies now have advantaged access to these huge markets, which was a fairly big economic boon, and countries which have gotten involved on that basis have become members of the EU have had great successes. The second benefit, of course, was the transfer payments, which was a big economic boost, and it allowed for economic development. It helped the fiscal situation. And the third benefit, not necessarily liked so much by the politicians involved, but certainly as a help to the country, was institutional help. You know, these countries often had problems with corruption, problems with inefficient public bureaucracies, you know, like even more efficient than the ones that we have, just to give you some context, and outmoded ways of doing things. And the EU did actually help with some of those issues, modernizing and getting rid of corruption and installing independent judiciaries and all of the rest. There was a fourth benefit, which was purely for the domestic audience, and that was the benefit of visa-free travel. If you're not on the visa-free list, you've got to travel to a capital city, you've got to stand in line at a queue, you've got to hand in a whole sheaf of documents to prove that you're not going to overstay your visa, that you're not going to go into the black labour market or anything like that. And then you've got to wait for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or however long it is until you get your visa. You don't know whether you're going to have to cancel your holiday or not. And it, you know, it can cost 200-300 euros for the privilege of doing all this. A lot of young people, especially business professionals, they're very much in favour of EU membership, if nothing else, just for the visa-free travel. You know, like they don't, you know, it's just so that they can have their holidays in Spain or in the, you know, Italy or wherever, and don't have to go through this visa thing. It's not going to cost them 300 euros extra in addition to the cost of the holiday, and it's not such a pain in the backside. Obviously, that visa-free travel benefit is still there, but a lot of the other benefits are actually starting to recede a little bit. For instance, the benefit of access to the market, it's still there and it would still hugely benefit Serbia. There's no doubt about that, and we shouldn't minimize that. But when Europe, as you quite rightly say, is starting to go along with the US in terms of its trade war with China, that starts to look really bad, especially for Serbia, which has got a lot of Chinese investment. It would also mean Serbia had to go along with the sanctions against Russia. That would be really bad for Serbia. It would be much higher energy costs. And the EU would insist on getting rid of all subsidies for, you know, energy and public utilities. It would mean much higher energy costs. It would mean slightly reduced trade benefits. The second point is that, you know, far from the kind of the independent judiciary and some of the bureaucratic and administrative improvements being the case, now an increasing amount of power is being centralized within the European Commission. A friend of the show, Thomas Fazzi, wrote about this for Unheard recently, where, you know, the Commission, rather than being the kind of like the arbiter between, you know, among the nations, is becoming almost like a presidential office. And they're accruing a great many executive powers. In addition to that, they're accruing some of the tools that can be used to coerce countries in ever more aggressive and painful ways to toe the line. And, you know, issues like the rule of law, which is officially one of the sticking points with Serbia, have been, again, used against Poland and Hungary to try to coerce them to toe the European line. So that these kind of things are looking less attractive as well. And the final point with regards to the transfer payments, that is also finally looking much less attractive because the EU is feeling hard up. It's feeling the pinch of sclerotic GDP growth. And at the same time, it's going to start having all of these bills come its way for Ukraine. And in fact, Ukraine might join the EU. That, Ukraine might not join NATO, but it might join the EU, and that's going to be the transfer payment to end all transfer pay. You might end up with a situation where, like, Ukraine and maybe one or two other countries get transfer payments and the rest become net contributors. So all of these things are making the EU marginally less attractive. And, I think it's very wise for Serbia to look elsewhere. And, it might be the case that the calculus for countries like Serbia is becoming less in favour of joining the EU. I still think it's in favour on balance, but certainly there are far more things to consider now than there were 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, perhaps. Straight talk.
So this week, two things happened in Asia Pacific, which were related. I think the bigger story is that China did some maneuvers, a polite way of phrasing it, around Taiwan. And by maneuvers, they simulated a blockade. More on that in a moment. At the same time, Rocket Man, Kim Jong-un, started firing off about South Korea. He got very mad that apparently, I think, drones were spreading pamphlets into North Korea, so completely confected reason, let's be honest. And he blew up a bunch of roads in between the two countries and started posturing artillery fire. This isn't unusual for North Korea, but the timing is interesting, and I think it relates to the Chinese encirclement or simulacrum encirclement of Taiwan. So let's say a bit more about the maneuvers that the Chinese undertook. We learned something that some of us have taught for a very long time, which is that China's strategy against Taiwan. They have now pretty much explicitly stated it. I don't know if any government officials stated it, but Chinese state television carried experts, and these experts would have the seal of approval of the government, let's just say. These experts communicated quite clearly that the strategy, if Taiwan ever declares independence, will be a blockade of the island. I've thought that for some time. The Americans have been saying for a long time that strategy would be to invade Taiwan. I've never thought that made much sense. It seemed to come out of sort of Saving Private Ryan, D-Day type fantasies, to be honest. Like, that's how we do it, so that's how they do it. But a blockade made much more sense. I mean, Taiwan doesn't have any resources, obviously. It's an island. It has semiconductors. It has a very good economy. And it has very good engineers and scientists and so on. But it doesn't have access to any raw materials. So if you enact a blockade on the island, you effectively besiege it. I mean, you could literally starve it of food. And then on top of that, if you really wanted to damage things, you could use missiles to strike water purification sites and make the island unlivable, in effect. But a siege of that sort would be a case of applying pressure. And I've always thought that that would be the most reasonable thing for the Chinese to do. Actually, there was an Atlantic Council report in December of last year which said the same thing. And it was quite a good report. It was a little over-optimistic on how much the Americans could deal with it. But, I thought it was a pretty good report. And I thought it got really underplayed because people continue to talk about this idea that Taiwan will be invaded if anything kicks off. It's a major problem for the US because their arming strategy of Taiwan means absolutely nothing if a blockade is enacted. If they are effectively arming ground troops to fend off an invasion, and they find themselves in a siege, what are they going to do with, limited short-range MLRS or tanks or infantry? Like, they're just going to be sitting there on the beach watching no ships come in and going hungry and running out of fuel. That's realistically the strategy. So I think this is a huge deal for the Chinese. The last thing I'd say on that front is Chinese state media also said that patriotic forces in Taiwan would help increase the pressure. That sounds to me to be kind of like a communist color revolution, as it were. So Taiwan will be facing down some serious problems if this strategy was ever enacted. Could the US break the blockade? The Red Sea and the Houthi situation says, to my mind, almost definitely not. I think this is enormously important for American strategy in Asia Pacific and where that whole thing's going. I've always thought that, Taiwan's basically a write-off for the Americans. I don't think there's any way that they can defend it, and they should just come to terms with that. quickly looping back in the situation in Korea, why would Kim Jong-un make these dramatic statements at the same time, in the same week as the Chinese are signaling this? I think the answer lies in the Middle East. What the Chinese and the North Koreans are signaling to the Americans is, if you get involved in a conflict in the Middle East, not if Israel get into a fight with Iran. I think everybody understands that America has very limited, actually, control over that situation. That really is in the hands of the Israelis. Of course, they could not send weapons or something. We won't go down that rabbit hole. But in effect, they can't really stop the Israelis from making decisions. They can only place pressure on them. I think everyone understands that. But what they're signaling is, if America ever got involved in a war with Iran, that is, if America actually went to war with Iran, really bad things could start happening in Asia Pacific, not just around Taiwan, but also with Korea. And that would be really problematic for America. If they went to war with Iran and China immediately blockaded Taiwan and then North Korea invaded South Korea, all hell would break loose. I mean, we wouldn't have World War III with nuclear weapons. I don't think we would. I think the American system, the global system, would literally just collapse within a week. It would completely collapse, and it would cause absolute chaos in DC. So I think that's the message that they're sending, and I'm sure it.
Well, it wouldn't just cause chaos in DC, it would cause chaos in every single country in the world. I'm not so sure that blockade is a good idea for China. The reason that I say that is because a blockade would give time for the Americans and other powers associated with them, like probably Europe, but certainly like Britain and several other countries within Europe, to put together a response which could involve a counter-blockade against China, in effect. It really could. And while that's less of an issue now than it was 2 years ago, because Russia, to a certain extent, has helped China solve or mitigate its Malacca Straits problem, still would have a huge effect on the Chinese economy. There could be literally a counter-blockade against China, which would have a devastating effect on the Chinese economy, and of course a pretty terrible effect on the world economy, which would be part of the calculus in countries getting involved or supporting such a blockade. Potentially the US would also be able to use its massive advantage again, something that's been closed, but a massive advantage in subsurface naval warfare, i.e. its fast attack nuclear submarines, against which it's my understanding that the Chinese still don't have much of a defense against. Although that is being solved at the moment because of relations with the Russians closing. The Russians do, in fact, have extremely good submarine technology in terms of quieting the sub sounds, but also finding US subs under the water as well. But at present, the Chinese don't have that. So in theory, US subs could come in and start sinking the surface ships that are blockading Chinese ports. The alternative would be that the Chinese wouldn't use ships to blockade the port and would just fire off missiles at merchant ships coming into Taiwan. But again, that wouldn't be a good look in terms of the balance of public opinion. Surely the ideal scenario for China is to get it over with quick, not have it rumble on for months and months and months, which a total blockade could well take. I mean, this is siege warfare, and in siege warfare, we know it takes a long time. It takes a very long time indeed to work. Germany in the First World War was blockaded for 4 years. 4 years, and they were slowly starving to death, but they were still able to continue as a society. I'm not sure this is an ideal thing with the US. For China as an option. It seems to me to make the mistake of not fully committing to the course of action that they've taken in the event that they want to coerce Taiwan into, in a situation where, say, Taiwan declares independence or seems to be very clearly moving in that direction. Where you are correct is it's without doubt that China would be able to really seriously disrupt Taiwanese society. There would undoubtedly be assassination attempts against senior military, intelligence and political leaders. There would be protests in the street led by genuine Chinese sympathizers, but no doubt as well certain paid Chinese agents. So, it would be a terrible mess. You're also right, I think, that what's been signaled here, North Korea don't necessarily have to invade South Korea to cause problems. A few years ago, they sunk a South Korean patrol boat. The North Korean submarine torpedoed a patrol boat. There was also, shortly after Kim Jong-un took control of the country, artillery attacks on a South Korean island. This sort of thing can tie down parcels of attention. The North Koreans can go farther and really start attacking the country, perhaps in a range of asymmetric ways, perhaps directly, I don't know. So you're 100% right that, I think if China, if Taiwan presented China with an option, Taiwan took steps that presented China with an option. Either you coerce us now, militarily or by other means, or lose us forever. At that stage, then I think China goes full spectrum against the whole US system within the Western Pacific. And the whole world's in serious trouble then, because any disruption of trade with China would be catastrophic for the world. Like the disruption of the oil and gas markets, the surge in gas prices in Europe, the fact that although they've come down from those prices now, we're seeing a slow motion deindustrialization in Europe by being dislocated from Russian markets, from Russian energy markets. That's just kind of like an hors d'oeuvre compared to what would happen if the full 3-course meal of dislocation from China took place. It would be an economic catastrophe. It would be Great Depression 2.0 territory, and like properly Great Depression 2.0 territory. Undoubtedly, there would be a range of wildfires on the Korean Peninsula, perhaps in islands in the North China Sea and in the South China Sea, in the Philippines, as far as Iran, Ukraine. It would really be a serious problem for the world. And even if it wasn't World War III, it would be like, Great Depression 2, and that's not good at all.